The chocolate cake sat untouched in front of my 6-year-old son, Tommy. 6 candles flickering like tiny beacons of hope in what had become the most humiliating moment of his young life. My mother-in-law, Eleanor Morrison, stood behind him with her manicured hands gripping his small shoulders, physically pulling him away from the birthday table at Grandview Manor, while his lower lip trembled with confusion and hurt. "Move along, Tommy," she commanded, with the icy authority that had terrorized 3 generations of Morrison family members. "Your cousin Sebastian needs this entire section of the table. He's our golden grandson, and today is really about celebrating his achievements, not your little milestone." My 4-year-old daughter Lily began crying as Eleanor shooed her away from the beautifully decorated head table, her tiny voice breaking as she asked, "Mama, why can't we sit with the birthday cake? It's Tommy's birthday." "Because, little girl," Eleanor replied with the kind of casual cruelty that takes decades to perfect. "Some children are more important than others. Sebastian just won the state junior golf tournament, and real achievements deserve real recognition. You are second-class children, and it's time you learned your place." The words hit me like physical blows. Second-class children. My babies, my beautiful, innocent, loving children, were being told by their own family that they didn't matter, that their birthday celebrations were less important than their cousins' sports achievements, that they were somehow lesser beings who should be grateful for scraps of attention. I watched my husband David across the room, engaged in animated conversation with his successful brother James, while their golden boy Sebastian basked in yet another round of adult adulation. David hadn't noticed his mother's latest act of emotional cruelty, because he had learned long ago to look away when Eleanor targeted the family members she considered expendable. "Eleanor," I said, stepping forward with my arms outstretched toward my crying children, "this is Tommy's 6th birthday party." The table arrangement was specifically designed for him and his friends. She turned to look at me with the kind of dismissive contempt usually reserved for servants who had forgotten their place. "Mary, dear, you really need to understand family priorities. Sebastian's accomplishments reflect well on the Morrison name. Your children's, well, they're still quite young, aren't they? Perhaps when they achieve something noteworthy, we can discuss more prominent seating arrangements." The condescension was breathtaking in its brazenness. Tommy had been moved away from his own birthday cake so that his 8-year-old cousin could hold court about a golf trophy, while 30 family members and friends watched my son learn that love in the Morrison family was conditional on performance and that he would never perform well enough to earn it. "I see," I said calmly, pulling out my phone with hands that trembled only slightly with controlled rage. "Well, Eleanor, I think it's time for a little rearrangement of priorities." She barely glanced at me, already turning her attention back to Sebastian's golf story, dismissing me as completely as she had dismissed my children. The woman who had spent 8 years making my life miserable, who had questioned every parenting decision I made, who had convinced my husband that his mother's happiness was more important than his wife's dignity. She had finally pushed me past the point of strategic patience. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the number for Grandview Manor's event coordination office. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Grandview Manor Events, this is Rebecca." "Rebecca, this is Mary Morrison," I said, watching Eleanor orchestrate the complete displacement of my children from their own birthday celebration. "I need to cancel the Morrison family event contract, effective immediately." "Ma'am, I'm not sure I understand. The event is currently in progress and I'm the property owner," I said clearly, loud enough that several family members began to turn toward me with curiosity. "I'm invoking the immediate cancellation clause in the facility rental agreement. Please shut off power and water to the main ballroom and notify all catering staff that the event is terminated." Eleanor's head snapped toward me, her expression shifting from dismissive contempt to confusion as she tried to process what I had just said. "Property owner?" she repeated, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that I had never heard before. I smiled at my mother-in-law for the first time in 8 years, feeling something that might have been joy as I watched her begin to understand that the daughter-in-law she had been tormenting was about to demonstrate exactly how much power she had been hiding. "That's right, Eleanor," I said as the first lights began to dim around us. "Welcome to my venue." The golden grandson was about to learn that not all achievements are created equal. The favoritism had begun before my children were even born, crystallizing into an unshakable family hierarchy that placed James's son Sebastian at the pinnacle of Eleanor's affections, while relegating any future children of mine to the periphery of family significance. I had watched the pattern establish itself during family gatherings for 8 years, each holiday and celebration reinforcing the message that some grandchildren were precious treasures, while others were tolerable obligations. Sebastian had been Eleanor's first grandchild, born to James and his wife Victoria, when Eleanor was still young enough to throw herself completely into the role of doting grandmother. The nursery she created in her home for Sebastian's visits was a masterpiece of interior design, complete with custom furniture, educational toys that cost more than most families' monthly budgets, and a professional mural depicting scenes from classic children's literature. When Tommy was born 2 years later, Eleanor's enthusiasm for grandmotherhood had already been fully invested in Sebastian. Tommy's designated space in her home was a converted guest room with a basic crib and minimal amenities, furnished with practicality rather than love. The message was clear from his first breath. Sebastian was the heir, while Tommy was the spare. "Sebastian is just so advanced for his age," Eleanor would announce at every family gathering, displaying his latest artwork, academic achievements, or athletic accomplishments, with the pride of a curator showcasing museum masterpieces. He tested into the gifted program at only 5 years old. The teachers say they've never seen such exceptional intelligence in someone so young. Meanwhile, Tommy's milestones, his first words, his first steps, his kindergarten graduation, were acknowledged with polite interest, but never celebrated with the same enthusiasm. When he brought home an excellent report card, Eleanor would offer brief praise before immediately transitioning to questions about Sebastian's more recent and presumably more impressive achievements. "How nice for Tommy," she would say with the tone of someone discussing mildly pleasant weather, then turn to James with genuine excitement. "Now tell me about Sebastian's science fair project. I heard from Mrs. Henderson that he might win the district competition." The differential treatment extended to every aspect of their interactions. Sebastian received elaborate birthday parties with professional entertainment and guest lists that included the most prominent families in our social circle. Tommy's birthdays were smaller affairs, often overshadowed by scheduling conflicts with Sebastian's activities or Eleanor's prior commitments to more important family events. Christmas had become an annual demonstration of the hierarchy, with Sebastian's gifts displayed prominently under Eleanor's tree, while Tommy and Lily received fewer, less expensive presents that seemed chosen more from obligation than enthusiasm. The inequality was so stark that other family members began to notice and comment, but always in whispered conversations that never reached Eleanor's ears. "It's not fair how she treats your kids compared to Sebastian," my sister-in-law Patricia had whispered to me during last year's Christmas dinner, watching Eleanor fuss over Sebastian's new bicycle, while Tommy played quietly with a basic toy truck. "They're all her grandchildren. They should all be treated equally." But Eleanor's favoritism wasn't just about gift-giving or attention distribution. It was about building a family narrative where Sebastian represented the Morrison family's best qualities, while my children were pleasant but unremarkable additions who shouldn't expect to compete for center stage. "Sebastian has the Morrison ambition," Eleanor would explain to visitors when they asked about her grandchildren, her voice carrying the pride of someone discussing a prized thoroughbred. "You can see it in everything he does, the way he approaches challenges, the natural leadership he shows with other children, the drive to excel that runs in our family's bloodline." When asked about Tommy and Lily, her responses were markedly different. "Mary's children are sweet, of course, very well behaved. They seem to take after their mother's side of the family more than the Morrisons, but that's not necessarily a bad thing." The implication was always clear. My children had inherited my allegedly inferior genes rather than the superior Morrison DNA that made Sebastian special. They were tolerated members of the extended family, rather than celebrated heirs to the family legacy. David had initially tried to defend his children when Eleanor's favoritism became too blatant, but his efforts were half-hearted and easily overruled by his mother's stronger personality. He had been trained from childhood to avoid conflict with Eleanor, and protecting his children would have required the kind of sustained confrontation that he was psychologically incapable of maintaining. "Mom doesn't mean anything by it," he would tell me when I expressed frustration about the obvious inequality. "She just connects better with Sebastian because she's known him longer. Once Tommy and Lily get older, I'm sure the relationship will deepen." But time had only made the favoritism more entrenched, more explicit, more damaging to my children's developing sense of their own worth within the family structure. Today, at Tommy's 6th birthday party, Eleanor had finally said out loud what her actions had been communicating for years. My children were second class, undeserving of the same love and recognition that Sebastian received as his birthright. That was the moment I decided to show her exactly what second-class treatment actually looked like. Eleanor Morrison had never wanted me to marry her son David, and she had spent 8 years making sure I never forgot that I was a consolation prize rather than her preferred choice for daughter-in-law. The woman she had handpicked for David was Victoria Lambert, now Victoria Morrison, wife of James, mother of the golden grandson, and holder of the coveted position as Eleanor's favorite female family member. "Victoria understands what it means to be a Morrison," Eleanor would say whenever she wanted to deliver indirect criticism of my approach to marriage, motherhood, or social obligations. "She has such natural elegance, such intuitive understanding of how to represent the family name properly." Victoria was everything Eleanor had hoped for in a daughter-in-law. Old money background, finishing school education, natural blonde hair that photographed beautifully at charity events, and most importantly, the ability to produce a grandson who reflected well on the Morrison family's genetic superiority. She moved through social situations with effortless grace, remembered everyone's names and personal details, and had the kind of quiet confidence that comes from never having doubted your place in the world. I, on the other hand, was middle-class background, state university education, brown hair that required expensive maintenance to look acceptable at family events, and apparently inferior breeding stock based on my children's failure to achieve Sebastian-level excellence. I worked part-time as a graphic designer, a career that Eleanor considered artistic, in the dismissive way that people use when they mean impractical and financially unreliable. "Mary tries so hard," Eleanor would tell her friends when discussing her daughters-in-law, the phrase carrying undertones of sympathetic condescension. "She just doesn't have Victoria's natural advantages. But David seems happy. And really, that's what matters most." The comparison was constant and devastating, reinforced through dozens of small interactions that communicated my inadequacy without ever stating it explicitly. Victoria's Christmas decorations were so tastefully sophisticated, while mine were colorful and fun. Victoria's children's birthday parties were beautifully orchestrated celebrations, while mine were such sweet, simple gatherings. Family photos provided another venue for demonstrating the hierarchy. Victoria and James always occupied positions of prominence in group shots, with Sebastian featured prominently as the star of the younger generation. David and I were positioned toward the edges, with Tommy and Lily often partially obscured by other family members, or relegated to the back row where their faces were barely visible. "Victoria just has such a photogenic family," Eleanor would comment, while arranging group portraits, making adjustments that somehow always resulted in my children being less prominently featured than their cousin. Some people are naturally camera-ready, aren't they? The financial disparity between the two Morrison households was another source of subtle but persistent comparison. James worked in investment banking and earned significantly more than David's engineering salary, a difference that was reflected in everything from vacation destinations to children's clothing quality to the kinds of gifts exchanged during holidays. Victoria found the most darling outfits for Sebastian at that boutique in the city, Eleanor would mention while shopping for children's clothes, her tone suggesting that parents who shopped at department stores were somehow failing their children's sartorial development. Social obligations provided yet another arena for demonstrating my inadequacy compared to Victoria's natural superiority. Victoria served on charity boards, organized fundraising events, and maintained relationships with the kind of socially prominent families that Eleanor considered appropriate Morrison family associations. I volunteered at Tommy's school, helped with church activities, and maintained friendships with neighbors and work colleagues who might be perfectly nice people, but who didn't enhance the family's social standing in any measurable way. Victoria's charity work brings such positive attention to the Morrison name, Eleanor would observe when family members discussed their various activities. It's wonderful when family members can contribute to the community in ways that reflect well on all of us. The implication, of course, was that my contributions were either invisible or embarrassing, certainly not the kind of activities that enhanced the family's reputation in meaningful ways. David had long ago stopped defending me against his mother's subtle but relentless campaign of diminishment. He had learned to survive Eleanor's expectations by avoiding confrontation, accepting her judgments without argument, and hoping that compliance would eventually earn him the kind of unconditional love that she seemed to reserve exclusively for James and his perfect family. "Just try to get along with Mom," he would tell me when I expressed frustration about Eleanor's behavior. "She means well, and family harmony is more important than proving points about fairness." But today, watching Eleanor physically remove my crying children from their own birthday celebration to make space for the golden grandson. I realized that family harmony was just another way of saying that my children should accept being treated as second-class citizens in their own family. It was time to show Eleanor what getting along with me actually required. The graphic design business I had been running from our basement office was generating far more revenue than anyone in the Morrison family suspected, but I had learned early in my marriage that financial success would only create new problems with Eleanor if she knew about it. Instead, I had maintained the fiction that I was a struggling artist who contributed minimally to our family's financial stability, while secretly building an empire that would have shocked my condescending mother-in-law. "Mary's little hobby is so sweet," Eleanor would tell her friends when they asked what I did for work, her tone suggesting that my profession was somewhere between volunteer work and expensive pastime. "She makes those computer graphics for small businesses. David is so supportive of letting her pursue her interests." Or, what Eleanor didn't know was that my little hobby had evolved into Morrison Creative Solutions, a boutique design firm that specialized in high-end branding for luxury hospitality businesses. My client list included 5-star hotels, exclusive restaurants, and premium event venues throughout the region. The work was challenging, lucrative, and had connected me with some of the most successful business owners in the area. The deception had been necessary from the beginning. During our first year of marriage, I had mentioned landing a significant client contract worth $15,000, excited to share my professional success with my new family. Eleanor's response had been swift and cutting. "Mary, dear, successful wives don't need to work for money," she had said, with the kind of pitying concern usually reserved for discussing character flaws. "When women have to supplement the family income, it suggests that their husbands aren't providing adequately. You wouldn't want people to think David can't support his family properly." The message had been clear. My professional success was an embarrassment to the Morrison family reputation, evidence of David's inadequacy rather than recognition of my capabilities. To protect my husband's dignity and my own sanity, I had learned to downplay my achievements and present my work as casual freelancing rather than serious business enterprise. But the business had grown exponentially, especially after I began specializing in hospitality branding. Restaurant owners, hotel managers, and event venue operators were willing to pay premium rates for design work that could transform their spaces into memorable experiences for customers. My portfolio included some of the most exclusive properties in the state. "Your branding completely transformed our customer perception," Marcus Webb, owner of the Grandview Manor Estate, had told me after my redesign helped increase his event bookings by 40%. "We've gone from struggling to compete with chain venues to being the premier destination for luxury celebrations." Marcus and I had developed a friendship based on mutual professional respect and shared appreciation for design excellence. When he mentioned considering retirement and looking for the right buyer to preserve Grandview Manor's reputation for elegance, I had made him an offer he couldn't refuse. The property acquisition had been structured through a shell company I had established to protect my privacy while building my real estate portfolio. Morrison Holdings LLC owned not just Grandview Manor, but also 3 other premium event venues and 2 boutique hotels that I had purchased over the past 3 years, using profits from my design business. David knew that my work was going well. Our family's financial situation had improved noticeably, allowing us to pay off student loans early and build substantial savings accounts. But he assumed the improvement came from his recent promotion, rather than his wife's business acumen. "We've been so fortunate," he would tell family members when they commented on our family's financial stability. "My engineering firm has been very generous with advancement opportunities." I had never corrected his assumption, because it preserved family harmony while allowing me to reinvest business profits into acquisitions that were building wealth far faster than David's engineering salary could have supported alone. The real estate portfolio was generating passive income of approximately $35,000 per month, money that I was reinvesting in additional property purchases and business expansion. Morrison Creative Solutions now employed 4 full-time designers and was bidding on contracts worth millions of dollars annually. Eleanor's assessment of my financial contribution to our family was off by several orders of magnitude. Instead of the struggling artist who barely covered her own expenses, I was actually the primary breadwinner whose income was supporting not just our immediate family's comfortable lifestyle, but also investments that were positioning us for genuine wealth accumulation. "Mary seems to be keeping busy with her little projects," Eleanor had commented just last week, observing me work on what she assumed was a small freelance assignment. but which was actually a $75,000 rebranding contract for a luxury resort chain. The irony was exquisite. The woman who had spent 8 years treating me like an inadequate provider was about to discover that the venues she had been using for family celebrations were actually owned by the daughter-in-law she considered financially insignificant. Today, at Tommy's birthday party, Eleanor was learning that underestimating people can have expensive consequences. The acquisition of Grandview Manor 18 months earlier had been more than just a business investment. It had been a strategic move to gain control over the spaces where my family's most significant events took place. Every Morrison family celebration for the past 5 years had been held at this elegant estate venue, where Eleanor could play hostess with maximum dramatic impact and minimal personal expense. "The Grandview Manor is perfect for our family gatherings," Eleanor had declared when she first discovered the property, touring the facilities with the imperious authority of someone accustomed to having her preferences accommodated without question. "The ballroom has exactly the right atmosphere for dignified celebrations, and the grounds photograph beautifully for our Christmas cards." What Eleanor hadn't realized was that her enthusiasm for the venue was creating an opportunity for me to gain leverage over family dynamics that had been beyond my control for 8 years. When Marcus Webb mentioned his retirement plans, an interest in finding a buyer who would preserve the property's reputation for excellence, I saw a chance to turn the tables on my mother-in-law's tyrannical control over family events. The purchase had been complex, requiring careful financial structuring to maintain privacy while demonstrating creditworthiness to sellers and lenders. Morrison Holdings LLC had been established as a legitimate business entity with its own credit profile, employee identification number, and legal documentation that protected my personal identity while enabling property ownership. "The buyer seems to understand our vision for maintaining this property's prestige," Marcus had told Eleanor during the transition period, never suspecting that the buyer was the daughter-in-law she dismissed as financially insignificant. "They've committed to preserving all the amenities and service standards that have made Grandview Manor special." Eleanor had been thrilled that her preferred venue would continue operating under new ownership, never thinking to investigate who the new owners might be or how their identity might affect her future use of the facilities. The property purchase had cost $1.2 million, financed through a combination of business profits and commercial mortgages that were easily secured, based on Morrison Creative Solutions' financial performance and the venue's established revenue stream from event bookings. The investment was generating positive cash flow within 6 months, covering all operating expenses while building equity in a property that was appreciating rapidly in value. But the financial benefits were secondary to the strategic advantages of controlling the space where Eleanor orchestrated her family theater. Every seating arrangement, every menu selection, every decorative choice that had previously been used to demonstrate family hierarchy was now subject to my ultimate approval as property owner. "The new ownership group has made some wonderful improvements," Eleanor had told her friends while planning various family celebrations, completely unaware that the improvements were being funded by the daughter-in-law she had been systematically undervaluing. "The upgraded kitchen equipment means the catering options are even more sophisticated now." The upgraded equipment had been my decision, part of a comprehensive renovation that had transformed Grandview Manor from a struggling event venue into the premier destination for luxury celebrations in the region. The improvements were attracting higher-end clientele and commanding premium pricing that was generating substantial returns on the initial investment. More importantly, the renovation had given me intimate knowledge of every system in the building. I knew where the main electrical panels were located, how the water supply was controlled, which switches operated which lighting systems, and how to disable various facilities remotely using the computerized building management system that I had installed as part of the modernization process. "The new automated systems are incredibly convenient," the venue's event coordinator had explained to Eleanor during the planning stages for Tommy's birthday party. "The property management company can control everything from lighting to temperature to music systems through a central computer interface." Eleanor had been impressed by the technological sophistication, never suspecting that the property management company was another subsidiary of my business empire, or that I personally controlled the central computer interface from an app on my smartphone. The contracts for family events were always signed by Eleanor, who presented herself as the organizer and primary contact for all Morrison family celebrations. But the actual financial responsibility fell to David and me, since Eleanor's income from her late husband's trust fund was substantial but not unlimited, and she preferred to let her sons cover expenses for gatherings that she considered their obligation to fund. "David and Mary are so generous to host these family celebrations," Eleanor would tell other family members, taking credit for organizing events that we were actually paying for, while making it sound like she was doing us a favor by allowing us to honor the family with elaborate parties. The irony had always bothered me, but today it was providing the perfect opportunity for revenge. Eleanor was about to discover that the daughter-in-law she treated as a second-class family member actually owned the venue where she had been holding court for 18 months. The Golden Grandson celebration was about to become a very different kind of memorable event. The first bank of overhead lights dimmed with theatrical precision, casting dramatic shadows across the ballroom as 30 family members and friends stopped mid-conversation to stare at the ceiling fixtures with growing confusion. The children's laughter at the entertainment stations faded to whispers as the room's elegant ambiance shifted from celebration to something approaching a stage production. "What's happening with the electricity?" James asked, looking around the room with the kind of managerial authority he brought to investment banking crises, already reaching for his phone to contact what he assumed would be venue management. Eleanor stood frozen beside the birthday table, her perfectly manicured hand still resting on Tommy's shoulder from when she had been physically relocating him to make space for Sebastian. The confident authority that had defined her personality for 73 years was beginning to flicker along with the lights. "Mary," she said, her voice carrying a note of uncertainty that I had never heard before. "What did you mean when you said this was your venue?" I smiled at my mother-in-law with the kind of patient warmth usually reserved for explaining complex concepts to small children. "I mean exactly what I said, Eleanor. I own this property. Morrison Holdings LLC purchased Grandview Manor 18 months ago, and I am Morrison Holdings LLC. The second bank of lights dimmed on cue, operated through the building management app on my smartphone with the precision of a Broadway production. The ballroom's crystal chandeliers, reduced to half power, created an atmosphere that was both intimate and ominous, transforming the elegant celebration space into something that felt more like an interrogation room. "That's impossible," Eleanor protested, though her voice lacked its usual conviction. You do those little computer graphics projects. You couldn't possibly own a property like this." "Actually, I own 4 properties like this," I said conversationally, enjoying the way Eleanor's face changed as she began to process information that contradicted everything she thought she knew about me. "Plus 2 boutique hotels and a design firm that generates more annual revenue than James's investment portfolio." David was staring at me like he was seeing his wife for the first time, his expression shifting between confusion and what might have been admiration. "Mary, what are you talking about? How could you own all of that without me knowing?" The question was fair and painful, revealing how completely I had hidden my professional success even from my own husband. "Because every time I mentioned business achievements, your mother made it clear that successful wives were an embarrassment to their husbands' reputations. So I learned to keep my success private to protect your dignity." The third bank of lights dimmed, leaving only the emergency lighting system to illuminate the increasingly surreal scene. Guests were beginning to move toward what they assumed would be exits, but the electronic door locks had also been activated through my building management system. "The doors seem to be stuck," announced Victoria, trying to maintain her characteristic poise while dealing with what was clearly an unprecedented situation in her experience of social gatherings. "They're not stuck," I explained calmly. "They're locked. This is a private family meeting now, and I thought it was important that everyone stay for the full conversation." Eleanor's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup, her usual commanding presence replaced by something approaching panic as she began to understand that she was no longer in control of the situation. "Mary, this is ridiculous. You can't just trap people in a building because you're upset about seating arrangements." "You're right that this isn't about seating arrangements," I agreed, pulling Tommy and Lily close to me while they looked around the darkened ballroom with wide eyes. "This is about 8 years of watching you treat my children like they don't matter, like they're less important than Sebastian, like they're second-class members of their own family." Sebastian himself was pressed close to James's side, his usual confident demeanor shaken by the adult drama unfolding around him. At 8 years old, he was old enough to understand that something significant was happening, but too young to process the complex family dynamics that had led to this moment. "Mommy," Tommy whispered, tugging on my dress with small fingers. "Why did the lights go out? Is the party over?" "No, sweetheart," I said, kneeling down to meet his eyes while keeping my voice gentle despite the tension crackling through the air around us. "The party is just getting started. But first, Grandma Eleanor needs to learn some manners about how we treat children in our family." Eleanor's shock was beginning to crystallize into indignation as she processed the reality of being challenged by the daughter-in-law she had been dismissing for 8 years. "Mary, I don't know what kind of power trip you think you're on, but this behavior is completely unacceptable. David, you need to control your wife." David looked between his mother and me, apparently recognizing that he was facing the kind of choice he had been avoiding for his entire adult life: support his mother's authority or protect his wife and children from her cruelty. "Actually, Eleanor," I said, standing up and activating the building's sound system through my phone, my voice now amplified through speakers positioned around the ballroom. "I think it's time for you to learn what unacceptable behavior actually looks like." The Golden Grandson celebration was about to become a very different kind of family gathering. The darkened ballroom had transformed into an arena where 8 years of suppressed family tensions were finally being dragged into the light, illuminated only by emergency fixtures that cast harsh shadows across faces that were struggling to process this complete reversal of family power dynamics. Eleanor stood in the center of the room like a dethroned queen, her usual authority evaporating as she faced the reality that the daughter-in-law she had been tormenting controlled not just this venue, but potentially their entire family's social infrastructure. "Mary, please," David said, his voice carrying a note of desperation as he tried to navigate between loyalty to his mother and protection of his marriage. "Can't we discuss this privately? Everyone's watching. The children are getting frightened." I looked around the ballroom at 30 family members and friends who were witnessing the Morrison family's carefully maintained facade crumble in real time. These were people who had attended years of family celebrations where Eleanor held court, while I served drinks and managed logistics, where Sebastian received standing ovations while my children applauded from the sidelines. "Everyone has been watching for 8 years, I said, my amplified voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "They've watched you allow your mother to treat Tommy and Lily like second-class citizens. They've watched me smile politely while being dismissed as an inadequate wife and mother. They've watched this family operate, according to rules that say some children matter more than others." Victoria stepped forward with the kind of diplomatic grace that had made her Eleanor's favorite daughter-in-law, her voice carefully modulated to suggest reasonable compromise. "Mary, I think we're all just surprised by this revelation about your business success. Perhaps if we could restore the lighting and continue Tommy's party, we could have a family discussion later about how to better acknowledge everyone's contributions." The attempt at peacemaking was well-intentioned, but completely missing the point. This wasn't about acknowledgement of my professional achievements. This was about the fundamental cruelty of telling a 6-year-old boy that his birthday was less important than his cousin's golf tournament victory. "Victoria, the discussion we need to have is about why Eleanor thought it was acceptable to physically remove my crying children from their own birthday celebration," I replied. "Tommy has been looking forward to this party for weeks. He helped choose the decorations, planned the games, talked about nothing else for days. And your mother-in-law just told him that his happiness doesn't matter, because Sebastian needs more space." Eleanor's shock was finally crystallizing into the kind of righteous indignation that had served as her primary emotional response to challenges throughout her adult life. "Mary, you are being completely unreasonable. Sebastian had legitimate achievements to celebrate, and it's natural for the family to acknowledge excellence when we see it. That doesn't mean we love the other children any less. Except that you literally just told Tommy and Lily that they are second-class children," I said, my voice rising with 8 years of accumulated frustration. "Not that Sebastian's achievements deserved recognition, that my children were inherently less valuable human beings who should accept inferior treatment as their natural place in the family hierarchy." The words echoed through the ballroom sound system with devastating clarity, forcing everyone present to confront the reality of what they had witnessed. There was no way to reframe Eleanor's statement, no diplomatic interpretation that could soften the blows she had delivered to 2 small children on what should have been one of the happiest days of their young lives. James moved to stand beside Eleanor in a gesture of filial support, though his expression suggested he was beginning to understand the magnitude of what his mother had done. "Mary, Mom obviously didn't mean to hurt Tommy and Lily's feelings. She was just trying to organize seating arrangements in a way that would work for everyone. James, your mother called my children second class and said they needed to learn their place," I replied. "In what universe is that an acceptable way to organize seating arrangements?" Sebastian tugged on his father's jacket, his young voice cutting through the adult tension with innocent confusion. "Daddy, why are Uncle David's kids second class? What does that mean?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. spoken by the very child whose alleged superiority had been used to justify the cruelty directed at his cousins. Even at 8 years old, Sebastian understood that something wrong had happened, that the adults around him were fighting about fairness and kindness in ways that didn't make sense to someone who had never been taught that some children were more valuable than others. David finally spoke, his voice heavy with what might have been recognition of his own failure as a father and husband. "Mom, you can't talk to children that way. Tommy and Lily are your grandchildren too. They deserve better from their family." Eleanor whirled on her son with fury that had been building throughout this confrontation, her careful social mask finally slipping completely. "David Morrison, your wife has lost her mind, locked us in a building, and is humiliating our entire family in front of 30 people because she's jealous that Sebastian gets recognition for his actual accomplishments. And instead of supporting your mother, you're taking her side?" "I'm taking my children's side," David said quietly, and for the first time since I had known him, he sounded like a father rather than someone's obedient son. The family was fracturing along lines that had been invisible for 8 years, each person forced to choose between maintaining Eleanor's authority and protecting children from emotional abuse. The moment stretched between us like a chasm that would define our marriage for whatever time we had left together. David stood 10 feet away from me in the darkened ballroom, his face illuminated by emergency lighting that made everyone look like actors in a film noir drama, while his mother waited for him to choose between the family loyalty that had governed his entire life and the wife who was demanding he finally act like a father. "David," Eleanor said, her voice carrying the imperious authority that had shaped his childhood and crippled his ability to make independent decisions. "This woman has clearly had some kind of breakdown. She's locked 30 people in a building, shut off the electricity, and is making wild accusations about family dynamics that are completely out of proportion to reality. As your mother, I'm telling you that you need to get control of this situation immediately." I watched my husband's face as he processed his mother's demand, seeing the familiar internal struggle that had played out during every family conflict for the 8 years of our marriage. David had been trained from infancy to avoid confrontation with Eleanor, to accept her judgments without question, to prioritize her emotional comfort over his own needs or those of anyone else who might conflict with her preferences. "Mom," he said carefully, his voice carrying the diplomatic tone he used when he was trying to avoid taking sides in family disputes. "Maybe we could all just take a step back and—" "No," I interrupted, my amplified voice cutting through his attempted neutrality with 8 years of suppressed fury. "No more stepping back, no more diplomatic solutions, no more pretending that keeping peace with your mother is more important than protecting our children from emotional abuse." Tommy and Lily were pressed against my legs, their small bodies trembling not from the darkened room, but from the adult anger crackling through the air around them. They had never seen me confront anyone with this level of intensity, never witnessed the kind of family conflict that their cousins probably experienced regularly in households where adults felt entitled to express their real feelings. "David," I continued, looking directly at my husband while our children listened to every word, "your mother just told Tommy and Lily that they are second-class children who need to learn their place. She physically removed them from Tommy's own birthday celebration to make space for Sebastian's ego, and now you have to decide whether you're going to be a husband and father who protects his family, or a son who enables his mother's cruelty because confrontation makes you uncomfortable." The choice was presented without diplomatic softening or face-saving alternatives. After 8 years of watching David avoid difficult decisions by finding middle ground that always somehow benefited Eleanor while leaving my children to absorb whatever damage resulted from his conflict avoidance, I was done providing him with options that protected his comfort while failing his family. Eleanor sensed the moment of decision approaching and doubled down on her emotional manipulation with the kind of calculated vulnerability that had been controlling David's behavior for 42 years. "David, sweetheart, you know how much I love you and your family. If I said something that hurt the children's feelings, of course I'm sorry about that. But your wife has clearly lost all sense of proportion. She's destroying Tommy's birthday party and traumatizing everyone present because she misinterpreted some casual comment about seating arrangements. The reframing was masterful. Eleanor, as the loving grandmother whose innocent comment had been misunderstood by an emotionally unstable daughter-in-law who was now terrorizing innocent family members because of her own psychological problems. It was exactly the kind of narrative that David had been accepting for years, whenever conflicts arose between his mother and his wife. But this time, Tommy himself spoke up with the devastating honesty that only children can deliver. "Grandma said we were second class. and that Sebastian was more important than us, he said in his small, clear voice. It made Lily cry, and it made my tummy hurt. Why did she say that to us on my birthday? The child's testimony cut through Eleanor's revisionist narrative like a knife through tissue paper. Tommy wasn't misinterpreting adult subtext, or projecting his own insecurities onto innocent comments. He was simply reporting what had happened to him, spoken in language that even a 6-year-old could understand, was meant to hurt. David looked at his son, then at Lily, who was still crying quietly against my leg, then at his mother, who was staring at him with the expectation that he would continue prioritizing her feelings over his children's well-being. "Mom," he said finally, his voice growing stronger with each word, "you can't talk to my children that way. I don't care what your intentions were or how you think your comment should have been interpreted. You made my son feel worthless on his birthday, and that's not acceptable." Eleanor's face went white with shock at this unprecedented rebellion from her most obedient child. "David Morrison, I cannot believe you would speak to your mother this way. I can't believe it took me 8 years to speak to you this way," David replied, moving to stand beside me and our children for the first time since our wedding day. The golden son had finally chosen his own family over his mother's authority. Eleanor's carefully constructed facade finally shattered completely as she realized that David's defection had cost her the family alliance that had enabled 8 years of emotional tyranny. Without her son's complicity in avoiding confrontation, she was facing the full weight of accountability for behaviors that had been protected by diplomatic silence and conflict avoidance. "This is insane," she declared, her voice rising to near shriek levels as the reality of her powerlessness began to sink in. "I have been nothing but a loving grandmother to all of my grandchildren. I have provided them with opportunities, experiences, and advantages that most children never receive, and now I'm being attacked by a daughter-in-law who has clearly manipulated my son against his own mother." The accusation of manipulation was particularly rich coming from someone who had spent decades perfecting the art of emotional control, but I was past the point of being hurt by Eleanor's desperate attempts to reframe herself as the victim in this scenario. "Eleanor," I said, my amplified voice carrying clearly through the ballroom's sound system, "let's talk about the opportunities and advantages you've provided. Let's talk about the Christmas where Sebastian got a $500 bicycle while Tommy got a $20 toy truck. Let's talk about the family photos where my children are consistently positioned at the back or edges while Sebastian is always prominently featured. Let's talk about the birthday parties where Sebastian's celebrations get professional entertainment while Tommy's get sheet cake from the grocery store." Each example I cited was met with murmurs of recognition from family members who had witnessed the differential treatment but had never acknowledged it openly. These were people who had attended years of Morrison family gatherings, where the favoritism was so obvious that outsiders commented on it, but where family loyalty had prevented anyone from challenging Eleanor's authority. "Let's talk about last year's Easter dinner," I continued, "when Sebastian spilled grape juice on your white tablecloth and you laughed about how boys will be boys. But when Lily accidentally knocked over a glass of water, you made her spend the rest of the meal sitting in the corner as punishment for being careless." Victoria was nodding slowly, her expression suggesting that she was finally acknowledging patterns she had chosen to overlook in order to maintain her position as Eleanor's favored daughter-in-law. "Mary, I remember that Easter. I thought Eleanor's reaction seemed disproportionate, but I didn't want to interfere in family discipline decisions." The admission that other adults had noticed Eleanor's cruelty but had chosen not to intervene, was almost as painful as the original incidents. My children had been absorbing emotional abuse for years, while family members stood by and watched, because maintaining social harmony was more important than protecting children from psychological damage. James cleared his throat with obvious discomfort, apparently recognizing that his own complicity in Eleanor's favoritism toward Sebastian had contributed to the pain inflicted on his nephew and niece. "Mary, I think we all need to acknowledge that Mom's approach to managing family dynamics has sometimes been less than ideal." "Less than ideal?" I repeated, my voice carrying 8 years of accumulated fury. "James, your mother told 2 small children that they were second-class human beings who needed to learn their inferior place in the family hierarchy. That's not poor management. That's emotional abuse." Eleanor's response was immediate and explosive. "How dare you accuse me of abusing children? I have devoted my life to this family, sacrificed my own needs to ensure that my grandchildren have every possible advantage, and poured love and resources into creating the kind of family legacy that most people can only dream of. You've devoted your life to creating a family hierarchy where Sebastian is treated like a crown prince, while my children are treated like servants," I corrected. and you've convinced everyone around you that this inequality is not only acceptable, but beneficial for character development. The sound of someone clapping slowly cut through the tension, and we all turned to see Patricia, David's aunt, standing near the back of the darkened ballroom with an expression of grim satisfaction. "Finally," she said, her voice carrying the relief of someone who had been waiting years for this confrontation. "Finally, someone in this family has had the courage to say what we've all been thinking. Eleanor, your treatment of Mary's children has been shameful, and we've all been cowards for enabling it by staying silent." The validation from another family member seemed to open floodgates, as several other relatives began nodding or murmuring agreement with Patricia's assessment. "The children notice everything," added my sister-in-law Margaret. "They know who gets the bigger gifts, the better treatment, the more attention. We've all seen Tommy and Lily watching Sebastian get praised while their own accomplishments are ignored." Eleanor looked around the room at family members who were no longer maintaining diplomatic silence, her expression shifting from righteous indignation to genuine fear as she realized that her authority was being challenged not just by me, but by the broader family coalition that had enabled her behavior through years of complicity. "You're all turning against me," she whispered, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "My own family is turning against me because of lies and manipulation from someone who was never really part of this family anyway. The last desperate attempt to other me, to position me as the outsider whose influence had corrupted natural family loyalty, revealed the depth of Eleanor's inability to accept responsibility for the consequences of her own choices." 3 months after Tommy's 6th birthday party became the most talked-about family gathering in Morrison family history, I sat in my home office reviewing the architectural plans for the Morrison Family Community Center that would be built on the land where Grandview Manor currently stood. The venue that had witnessed Eleanor's final act of cruelty toward my children was being transformed into something that would benefit dozens of families, instead of just hosting private celebrations for the privileged few. "The therapy wing looks perfect," said Dr. Sarah Martinez, the child psychologist who had been consulting with me on the center's design to ensure it would serve families dealing with intergenerational trauma and emotional abuse. "Having dedicated spaces for family counseling will make it easier for people to address these kinds of destructive patterns before they become entrenched across multiple generations." The community center had been my response to learning that the Morrison family's dynamics weren't unique, that countless families struggled with favoritism, emotional manipulation, and the kind of psychological damage that gets passed down through generations because no one knows how to break the cycle. Tommy and Lily were both in individual therapy now, working with specialists who understood how to help children process the complex emotions that come from realizing that adults they trusted had been treating them unfairly. The healing was slow but steady, marked by small victories like Tommy asking for what he wanted instead of waiting to see what he would be offered, or Lily expressing anger when something bothered her instead of automatically assuming she was wrong. "Sebastian wants to come to Tommy's next birthday party," David had told me the week before, sharing news that would have been unimaginable 6 months earlier. "He says he misses playing with his cousins, and he's sorry that grown-ups made their family time weird." The 8-year-old had adapted to the new family reality better than most of the adults, apparently relieved to discover that he could maintain relationships with Tommy and Lily without being constantly positioned as superior to them. Without the pressure of representing family excellence, Sebastian was free to just be a kid who enjoyed spending time with his cousins. Eleanor, on the other hand, had not adapted well to losing her position as family matriarch. The revelation that her dismissed daughter-in-law was actually wealthier and more successful than anyone in the Morrison family had shattered her sense of social hierarchy in ways that required professional help to process. "She's agreed to family therapy," David reported, after one of his careful phone calls with his mother, who had been maintaining minimal contact with our immediate family, while she worked with a therapist who specialized in narcissistic personality patterns. "She says she wants to understand how her behavior affected the children, but she's struggling to accept that her intentions don't excuse the impact." The therapy was probably too late to fully repair Eleanor's relationships with Tommy and Lily, who had learned to be wary of adults whose love came with conditions and expectations, but it might prevent her from inflicting similar damage on future grandchildren, which was a worthwhile outcome even if it didn't heal the wounds she had already created. Victoria and James were navigating their own recalibration, working to understand how their complicity in Eleanor's favoritism had contributed to their nephew and niece's suffering. Victoria's children's charity work had taken on new focus as she applied her organizational skills to supporting families affected by emotional abuse. "I keep thinking about all the times I knew Eleanor was being unfair, but chose not to say anything because it didn't affect Sebastian directly, Victoria had confessed during one of our increasingly honest family conversations. I was protecting my son's advantages instead of protecting all the children's emotional well-being. The acknowledgement of how privilege had made her passive in the face of injustice was prompting Victoria to become more actively involved in advocacy for children who didn't have advantages to protect them from adult cruelty. My marriage to David was stronger than it had ever been, built now on honesty about finances, parenting decisions, and family boundaries instead of the diplomatic avoidance that had characterized our relationship for 8 years. David was learning to be a father who protected his children instead of a son who protected his mother, a transformation that was benefiting our entire family. "I'm proud of what you did," he told me while we watched Tommy and Lily play in our backyard, their laughter carrying the kind of carefree joy that had been rare before they learned they were worth defending. "I should have stood up for them years ago." "You're standing up for them now," I replied. "That's what matters." The Morrison Family Community Center would open in 18 months, funded by the sale of my event venue properties, and designed to provide resources for families who needed support in building healthier relationships across generations. Sometimes the best revenge is building something better than what you're replacing.